Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We are going to talk about clinical data and incorporate that into a quick presentation by me, and then we'll sit down and have a Q&A with you all. And we really hope that everyone asks questions and really make this a lively discussion. So the million-dollar question is, we have a need to collect clinical data. How much does it cost? I mean, just this past 2 days, I've probably been asked that question every 30 minutes in the rooms here. And the answer to that question is really up to you all. How much what do you want to do with that data? And that decision really, you implement that from the beginning of your study, and that decision really affects the duration of your study, your product life cycle, approval, and beyond. So we thought today we would compare that to building a house, just to kind of give it a real life example of what you put into the beginning of your study and your decision of how you're going to design your study to approval and beyond. So just like with building a house and you need your blueprint, you need to have your protocol. Your protocol is the beginning of your clinical study, and the decisions that you make that go into that protocol affect the duration of the study and beyond with approval. So just like with building a house, you have to get your blueprints approved by the county. You have to get your protocol approved by regulatory authorities. You have to get it approved by FDA, by your IRBs, whether it's a central IRB or a local IRB. And that creates the framework and the foundation for running your clinical study. The content that goes into that protocol is really your playbook for the rest of the phase of your product. So while you're building this framework, it is incredibly important that you partner with the right vendors, with the right sites, with the right investigators to provide the foundation of success for your trial. The most important decision you make once your protocol is written is who's going to execute it. And you're just handing off your product, your technology, out to the world to execute that. So you have to ensure that you have someone to run the study for you, someone to manage your study, that you have investigators that not only see the patient population, have the time, but have the infrastructure, the sites to support that clinical data collection. And while you're making those decisions at the beginning of your study, of the framework of your house, of your study, is that database, that vendor. Just yesterday, I was in a meeting and I was told there's over 75 EDC platforms now. I imagine there's even more. But you have to find one that works. It can't just be the inexpensive one because you're trying to save money at the beginning of your study. You need to ensure that EDC, that platform where you're collecting your data, is easy to use for everyone. That's what's going to, in the end, give you the tables, the listings to submit to FDA, to submit to the notified bodies. You need to ensure that data that's collected is easy to use, it's comprehensible, and it's most importantly easy for the sites, because you need those sites and those study coordinators and those surgeons and PIs to be able to track their data easily. So while you're making these decisions about the database and what you're going to do and building it, and you've reached out to sites and you've reached out to PIs, and now you know who you want to use, you have to develop a contract and a budget for each of those sites to enroll to participate in your study. That is an incredibly burdensome process at the beginning of a study. It can take, the fastest we've ever seen it here at my company, MCRA, is 2 weeks. The longest is probably 9-10 months. It can take a long time, and that's typically not even started until you have IDE approval. You have your protocol, you have your finalized protocol. So that is an incredibly important piece of the puzzle that you need to ensure that you have queued up as to just hit the ground running once you have your final protocol and you have your sites chosen. So you have a lot of decisions to make too, right, at the beginning of your trial. And it always goes back to cost, right? If we spend money now, does it save us money in the future? Do we have the money to spend now? And just like with building a house, do you want the builder grade windows because it's saving you costs at that expensive time? But then in 10 years, you might realize you've lost so much money with energy, and electrical bills are so high that you have to rip out those windows. How much is that going to cost you compared to investing in the beginning in those fancier windows that are energy efficient? And that's really how we see reimbursement. Do you have the time and the capability and the funding to be able to just put some easy, quick time points into the beginning of your study? Something as simple as blood loss or hospital stay, return to work, just some simple questions can go a long way at the end of your trial with payers. So throughout the trial, you have to be inspection ready. That means at any time, FDA can show up at your door. FDA can say they are reviewing your patient files, your trial master file. They can do that for cause, not for cause. We have been through multiple for cause, not for cause, surprise inspections, and they're bare. And you have to be prepared from the beginning of your trial to ensure that you have that compliance piece, the regulatory piece, meaning the trial master file, the IRBs, that your sites are in line with the protocol, the patients being enrolled are the appropriate patients, you're tracking adverse events. All of that has to be done from the beginning of the study. So you need to ensure that the partners you work with have that core capability, that they're able to do that. So enrollment is what everyone talks about. Every CEO is like, yes, we got our first patient, we got our 10th patient, 500th patient, whatever it is. And that's fantastic. Obviously we need to get those patients in. You don't want to have that process be too fast. You don't want to speed that process. You want to make sure that the sites you're bringing on, when you're activating those sites, that they're ready to be activated, because you don't want to mess up that piece. You want to ensure that the partners that you bring in provide that framework that they can support you with those patients that come in. Because what's so important, you can have 500 patients enroll in your study, but what you need is 500 patients to complete your study. That first data point is enrollment, but if you don't have the follow-up, if you don't meet your primary endpoint because you didn't have patients follow up, what was the point of your study? So to go back to those partners that you choose in the beginning, you need to ensure that your sites, that your patients, that your sponsors, your CROs, that everyone's working together to ensure a successful study. And that means really providing that framework of communication, of commitment to the trial from the beginning. And then last but not least is that, that final walkthrough, getting your keys, that excitement, and is the clinical study report. And that's the story that you've been telling from that moment of your protocol development. You write that story and you submit it for FDA approval or whatever you're looking for to have for those data needs. And that's the whole purpose of doing it, is to get that excitement, get those keys to the new house, get the data. So back to that beginning question, how much does it cost? It really is dependent on what your goals are. What are you looking for to achieve? And making sure that you partner early on with the correct people to help you get there. So now we are going to move over to our panelists. Our panelists are going to introduce themselves, and we're going to ask some questions that I have written already. But anyone in the crowd, please just raise your hand. I'm happy to take questions throughout. We'd love to have a more interactive session. So thank you.
Hey, everyone. My name is Max Bikoff. I'm with Longitude Capital. We are a investor, so we're a venture and growth firm. Been around for about 15 years, a little over that, raised about $2 billion over the course of that to invest exclusively in healthcare. So as a firm, we invest in biotech, medical devices, healthcare software and services. And personally, I focus on our medtech practice. So I've been on the investment side for about 6 years. I'm thrilled to be here.
Hi, I'm Dave Hovda. I'm CEO of InnoVein Medical. We've developed a venous valve replacement for treating deep venous reflux. Before that, I worked in spine for about 15 years. Been part of 4 IDE studies. We've enrolled over 1,100 patients. 4 studies, but I've been part of 2 PMA approvals. In those 2 PMA approvals, we're working with MCRA. Thank you very much. We were very pleased. We had the 2 fastest PMAs ever approved in spine. So I think when it comes down to cost, time is money, burn per month is money. If you get well organized, pick the right sites, things go smoothly, it can be very efficient. And we were very fortunate to have those very efficient studies. So thanks to our colleagues. Nice to be here. Thanks.
Awesome. Hi, everybody. My name is Michael Anselmo. I am the Vice President of Reimbursement, Health Economics, and Market Access for MCRA. I'm the relative new person here. I've been with the company for about 6 months. I came out of industry where I held similar roles for a number of companies. My most recent company was Silver Cloud Health. We had a successful exit 2 years ago out of the digital space. I will say one of the things I got when I got there was they were waving around all these clinical trials, all these clinical studies. And they were having problems getting getting hospitals and systems and payers to buy the technology. And I said, okay, great. Well, where's your health economic stuff? What do we have that shows value? They had nothing. And if you want to talk about expenses during a clinical trial, just wait till you spin up a sales force that cannot sell anything. That's even more expensive. So looking to leverage a lot of my insights and findings, and excited to be here.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Glenn Stiegman, Senior Vice President of Clinical and Regulatory Affairs at MCRA. I oversee both the regulatory and clinical groups at MCRA, with Abigail leading our CRO. Been with MCRA for about 17 years. Prior to joining MCRA, I was at FDA as the branch chief of orthopedics. MCRA initially started in the musculoskeletal world, since expanded quite effectively into a lot of other therapies. Many of those obviously require clinical data. And excited about this conversation.
Thanks, everyone. So let's get it started. So Max, let's start with where it begins. To even consider a company to invest in, what data do you like to see?
That's a great question. I'm going to go back to early consulting days, and it's a little soon to play this card, but it depends, honestly. So I think first caveat is every investor is different, every firm is different. People value different aspects and are willing to take different levels of risk. Some folks really like high science, new mechanism. This has never been done before. Other firms and groups are looking for a more mature data package. We fall into the bucket of looking for things that are clinically de-risked. But what does that mean? That doesn't necessarily mean you've got your PMA or your 510K approved and you're already on market. For us, there are different ways to get to clinical de-risking. One aspect is just lateral evidence. So, if this is something where you've innovated on the hardware, on the procedure, on the approach, but the business end is the same, right? What's delivering the therapeutic value to the patient is the same, then we can go a little bit earlier. We invested in 2 neurostim companies relatively recently, and they innovated on how you power these devices. But at the end of the day, it's a lead placed on a nerve, delivering electricity to a known nerve target. So we were really confident it was going to work clinically. There were other technical things to jump through. So that's an example of clinical de-risking. For things that are on the newer, more novel MOA type, mechanism of action type projects, what I tend to look for are things that are highly objective endpoints. What you hate to do is to step back from your first 10, 20, 30 patients and say, this is great, patients are doing awesome, but I don't know how much of this is sham effect or placebo. So we're looking for highly objective things. And an example here is we've got an early stage mitral repair company treating mitral regurgitation. On the table whether or not you've helped that patient, right? There's no sham effect. You see the effects of reducing mitral regurgitation in the procedure. So that's an example where, we feel like the first couple of patients are highly de-risked. And that's the way we've approached it. But as I said, different investors, different philosophies.
I love it. Thank you. So David, as CEO, when do you start thinking about the clinical study? When do you put that into your business plan?
So I would say right up front, we recently treated our first patients. We closed the financing round in January, but a lot of our discussion had to do with our pivotal trial design, how many patients. It's going to affect the timeline. It's going to affect the amount of capital, and we've not yet treated a single patient. So I think, of course, you have to figure out what it's going to take to get to your human clinical release and prove that you have something promising before you get to the pivotal. But the questions coming at you about your pivotal are very early indeed, yeah.
And Mike, from your perspective, when should we start thinking about reimbursement in a clinical study design?
To be honest, it's never too early. And I think, we met with a customer this morning and we're talking about, let's include some of these endpoints in here. It's, might add a little bit of time, a little bit of complexity, a little bit of risk or cost to your trial, but, you don't get to that endpoint of, you got a great clinical thing, no idea what value it actually brings to our, our patients at the end of the day. And, you get to it, you launch a product, and then your sales stall out, and that gets really difficult. And, one of the theme I've really seen here is it seems the investors are wanting to see more, okay, what is your reimbursement strategy? I think, the tenor of investment has changed. It's no longer, hey, it's a great clinical, we'll figure the rest out later, but now it's, we need to understand the business path forward. And that comes down to the economics, the reimbursement. Why is somebody going to pay me $1,000 every time I turn this device on? Mm-hmm. We need to explain why, and that's pretty much a question you can't ask too early.
Yeah. And Max, do you have any thoughts to kind of reimbursement? When do you start thinking about it?
Immediately, absolutely. And you see a lot of companies kind of get caught in this trap where it feels like you've had this gift from the FDA where, okay, this is an endpoint I know I can meet. This is something that's a little bit easier, maybe a lower bar, but it doesn't satisfy that payer question. And to your point earlier, that's where you can really lose a lot of time, a lot of money, is commercializing something where you're just running into a brick wall, i.e. the payers and coverage. So you can't start thinking about it soon enough, honestly, but I do think there's, there are patterns here around what makes for a good reimbursement package, what's going to be meaningful to the payers. And obviously hard outcomes is a key piece. If you're saving lives, you've got a real therapy, but there are other tried and true paths here. You take something that's based in a hospital, highly invasive, i.e. highly expensive, and you move that into an ASC or an office. That's savings for the payer. That's a win-win-win for everybody. You look at some of the downstream impact if you're reducing hospitalizations, reoperations, expensive medications, dealing with compliance. These are all angles where it's a win. And to your point, it's probably one of the single greatest risks that companies face, oftentimes more so than FDA, which has done an excellent job and is, in most cases, highly, highly predictable. But as a firm, we're willing to take on reimbursement risk. I think for us, though, it's about having the moral high ground, right? So if you've got the data that moves the needle on cost, that moves the needle on outcomes, then I think that's a battle we're willing to take, because from there it's downhill. It's time, it's money, it's execution. But you've got the upper hand in those conversations because you're bringing value to the system, and we're willing to take that on.
Right. And David, do you have something?
So it was brought very clearly to my attention a couple years ago. We were talking with a pretty large strategic about what are the key aspects of what they look for in acquiring a company, exits, and so forth. And the comment was, you're going to hate to hear this, but for us, question number one is, can you get paid for it? Question number two is, does it work? And then question number three is IP and so forth. So of course, it's got to work. But it did make an impression upon me, of course. You've got to have a reimbursement strategy. You've got to have a path forward. It's right up there at the top, with strategics. Absolutely.
Great. So keeping in line with cost, you have to decide what type of study to start and when to start the study. So Glenn, do you have any thoughts on a feasibility study versus just diving right into the pivotal and the ramifications and from that?
Yeah, sure. So, Max kind of stole a lot of what I was going to say by de-risking.
You're welcome.
Yeah, de-risking the study, and there's a lot of companies here, and they're still trying to figure out the best maybe approach for their product, the equipment, the instruments. So if there are some serious questions, and certainly starting very slow, starting with feasibility, first in human type studies to sort of figure out any unknown variables that could impact the long-term safety profile, effectiveness profile of that particular product. If it is something like nerve stimulator where you said you had a lot of confidence in it's going to work, then those would be scenarios where certainly don't waste your time with a feasibility type scenario. Jumping into a pivotal where you have that confidence just drives a more efficient process, and it gets you to market that much faster. But it's really the confidence and de-risking, because those first 5 patients are critical to the eventual success of your study or of the company, because it's going to set you back. If there's one misstep, one wrong implantation, if the usability is in question, whatever it may be, then all of a sudden you're like a year delayed trying to fix that instrument, whatever it may be. So it's a tough decision for a lot of companies because they do want to take it slow, be careful, but yet every step takes millions of dollars and years of time.
Yeah. Max, do you have any thoughts on this from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think you raised a lot of good points, right? There's this tension that you have around going fast, taking as little capital as possible, but also de-risking and being ready for pivotal. And it is a tension. It's very case-by-case specific. I mean, if you look at our broader industry, the average exits in medtech are $200 million plus or minus. If it takes you $150 million to get there, we can all do that math. I mean, that's not a huge return for your investors, which is at the end of the day the business that I'm in. So it's a real tension. But I think Mike, you may raise this point, which is losing time is way worse, right? Having to go and rework, because that's much more expensive, right? When you're carrying the whole burn of the entire company or a commercial organization or something like that, that's when things really start to add up. So you have to be confident that you're ready for pivotal, and you learn so much in those early feasibility studies around just execution. How fast enrollment, all the steps that you talked about, like building a house. You learn all of that in your early studies, and that's kind of the best predictor of what's going to happen when you enter the pivotal stage. I think the other point that's always very resonant for me, it's a little bit of a pet peeve, but patient selection and knowing who your target patient is, who's a good patient, who's not a fit, is so critical here. Because that pivotal data set, I mean, it's not just driving your approval, but you live with that for many, many years. It drives your marketing, your communication to physicians, your conversations with payers. And so you have to be super confident in that. And, in medtech, we ask patients to undergo a lot, right? We're asking for a permanent implant or an open surgery or general anesthesia. And I think knowing your target patient population is so important, because if you end up and 20-30% of your patients do great, but 70-80% don't, even if it's safe, that's a lot to ask of the healthcare system. So, figuring that out early and not late is so important. So I think most often it's better to go slow to go fast. But in rare occasions, right, when you can skip the line, there's some benefit to that.
So kind of going along with your study design, right? That's what you just kind of start talking about. Glenn, how do you think about the control arm? I mean, just this week we've been asked so many questions about control arms, and how do you approach that?
Well, I think it goes, primarily to what you said in your presentation, and that's the objective of the study. Being from the regulatory world, obviously a lot of the protocols that we're developing, we have the FDA in mind, and I'll include Mike into the conversation so we get the reimbursement perspective. But ultimately, we're trying to show what this product does compared to another product out there. Now, if it's for strictly regulatory purposes, maybe a sham control, maybe a placebo control will be fine from the FDA perspective, and they'll push that onto you. But I know that's not going to do anything from the reimbursement perspective. If it's for reimbursement, then what is the standard of care? If it's for distinguishing your device from others, maybe you're going against a competitor. So there's a lot of considerations based on the objective. And then you have to consider, okay, if we choose this control from a regulatory perspective, what is its effectiveness profile? What is its safety profile? Because then you're sort of pushed into aligning yourself with that particular product. You're forever going to be compared to that particular product or that control. So it's really a difficult decision. And as Max said, you're laying the groundwork of all of this data, and David has lived through it. And you want to pick that control that's going to resonate with surgeons and physicians and payers, and not do something that's outdated or not used, but also something you have confidence you're going to win. So you can make those claims, make the reimbursement strategy executed.
And just echoing on that, I think it does get very hard is when you talk to payers, these are patients who would get some treatment, standard of care. What are they getting today? They're not going to just get sham. If I need a knee replacement, they're going to get something to help their knee. So if you're comparing against, okay, just, no knee replacement, it's safe and effective, payer's going to look at that and say, well, I'm going to spend this anyway, so what makes you special? So it does feed into some of those downstream needs, which I know are very difficult to think of at the early stage when you're just trying to get a product developed and through regulatory pathways and raise capital. It's really hard to think of okay, 4 years from now when I launch this commercially, I need to do X, Y, Z. That is a real hard decision, real hard investment to make. But 4 years from now, when your burn rate is much higher, I will keep harping on that point because I've seen sales forces just saying, we can't do it. It's a real hard decision. So it's build those endpoints against your competition, against the standard of care. I remember when I was with Abbott, we were having our trial with our left atrial occlusion device. We were going up against Watchman because what's the new standard of care? Watchman. We weren't going up against ablations anymore. So that was a real hard decision, but we also knew 4 years from now when we launch our device, we would go to market and say, we're better than Watchman. And ironically, Boston loved this idea too, because they said, if you go to market and you're not better than Watchman, we're going to wave your trial around. So
it's such an important decision as you're going through, right? Is it going to be against meds? Is it going to be against sham? Is it going to be against the gold standard? Or did you get a single arm study, something like that? I mean, I think as we start to evaluate these, a lot of it comes down to how well do we understand this control arm? And there are lots of areas where people think they understand, but you get caught in a trap, right? So heart failure, for instance. If you're going up against meds and heart failure, I mean, it's been studied time and time and time again, but that drug therapy has been improving a lot over recent years, right? We've got Entresto, we've got the SGLT2s. What medical management gold standard looks like in heart failure today is so different than maybe the 10, 12 studies that you're pulling as you're building your clinical trial assumptions for what a control arm is going to do. So, we think a lot about how predictive are those prior studies in terms of what your expectations and what you're powering for. So that's a big piece. And this maybe goes back to early feasibility studies or a pilot RCT, which maybe isn't going to give you all the statistics you want, but you get a read on what that control arm is going to be in a modern era in your patient population. And that is a huge de-risking for folks. The other point I'd just add on control arm, just because this came up relatively recently with one of our companies, is for single arm studies. And I'm a bit of a purist, I prefer RCTs. It's just, it brings you the context you need when you're evaluating a new technology, and I think that's true for me and probably everyone else that's looking at things. But sometimes it's just not feasible. So we recently invested about a year ago in a company called LimFlow, who I think presented a couple days ago in one of these sessions. It's a therapy for end-stage peripheral vascular disease, patients who have no other options and are about to get their legs amputated. You can imagine, you can't randomize a trial like that. You can't go to a patient and say, hey, we've got this new therapy. Do you want to enroll? There's a 50-50 shot that we're going to have to amputate, but we have this other thing that might work, right? No patient is going to sign up for something like that. So how do you bring context to a study there? And what they did, which I think is super, super clever, they ran a real-world registry in parallel to their single-arm pivotal trial, which, it's not randomized, but it's as close as you could get for a pseudo control arm. And I think that will pay dividends for them. Mm-hmm. So there are, different strategies here, which sometimes you have to think a little bit outside of the box.
And just to add to that, because you brought up a really good point. And while that's an extreme example, but a real world one, the choice of control, you also have to think about, while it's study design decision, it's also in the enrollability of the study itself. The standard of care, when you're running up against something very novel, new, and shiny, patients want that. Surgeons want to implant that. They don't want to go back to this, 2-decade-old standard of care. So the enrollability of a control arm also has to be considered, because we run up against a lot of times where, we're trying to do 2-to-1 randomization, 3-to-1 randomization, because no one wants to be on the control side.
I'll just add one thing to that too. So we randomized to fusion. I was worried about losing patients to follow-up because I could just walk in and get a fusion. Why am I coming back for 2 years plus? One other thing to consider, we did, again, working with MCRA, we bought a data set, which we used as a control. So effectively, we did a prospective single-arm study. We had confidence in the control arm because it was used as the basis for an FDA-approved product. So FDA had already seen that data. It saved us a lot of money, saved us a lot of time. We could focus just on the investigational device. So it wasn't obviously the complete randomized control, but there's statistical analyses you can do to effectively make it similar. And so that was a big win for us, and something that might be something you could consider.
So back to you, David. What as you now have your study design, you've decided on what you're going to do with your study and your pivotal study. Talk to me about site selection. Like, how do you decide? Do you want that KOL? Do you want that name, or do you want the smaller mom and pop shop that can bring in more patients? How do you approach that?
Yeah, I think maybe borrowing from Max, we want both, right? You like to have some KOLs because it brings a certain amount of credibility just because they're working with you, and that's kind of a semi-seal of approval, but they also tend to be really busy. They've got a lot of other things going on. Maybe you don't get the focus you're looking for. So I think there's an important combination there of busy physicians who can help enroll your study, but some KOLs as well. And then, I think academic versus private. You like the prestigious academic sites. It depends on what you're evaluating, but you get good treatment at academic sites. But in the clinical trial agreement, like you were talking about, that can really extend to 9 months. You have more overhead. You just have more hoops to jump through, whereas you can move much more quickly in some of the private sites. So we really focused on that too. 2 other things I would say, which are key focus, so you don't have to put me on this. One is previous IDE experience. I mean, once you've been through an IDE, it's almost shocking how much work it is and how difficult the follow-up is, and just the whole tremendous amount of support. So in my case, if a surgeon said, geez, I'd really like to be in an IDE study, but they had never been an investigator, never been a co-investigator, had no idea what they were getting themselves into, I was pretty skeptical about that. And one thing I learned very much is they need a good study coordinator. And we were so focused initially on, this is a great surgeon and a great site, and they've got a lot of potential patients, but they didn't have the research support, and we paid for it early on, big time. So I think it's really important to have a research team / study coordinator that's not a med school student who's going to get rotated every 3 months, because there's no continuity. So ID experience, great study coordinator, and a combination of, I'd say, KOLs and busy physician.
Yeah, and as the clinical expert here at MCRA, I absolutely support that, especially from my perspective of really collecting that data and ensuring that the patients come back and that they understand what the study and the purpose of the study is. So kind of switching gears a little bit, back to kind of this reimbursement, right? We really care about, right, that's the point, like David taught us. So what do you tell our clients? What do you tell the startups at the beginning of the trials, like this study design? And you always talk about that, one randomized control trial isn't enough. So tell me more about that. What do payers really want to see for the $1 million question?
Yeah, no, that is the $10 million question. So I wouldn't even say it's one randomized clinical trial is not enough. Sometimes it can be. The question is just, is it powered enough? Are you going to be able to walk this into a payer, CMS, in 4 years, 5 years, and convince them the device not only does what you say it's going to do, but does it in a cost-effective manner, in a clinically safe manner, in a way that is going to bring benefit for a payer? you see some trials and it's like, oh, we've got 12 people. The payers look at that. Now, I mean, certain conditions, yes, but I mean, if you're bringing a pacemaker to market and you've got a sample of 12 people, they're going to basically laugh at you and say, why are you even bothering me? But you want it to be powered enough, significant enough there. You want it to have enough time. Because great, it works at 2 weeks, 3 weeks. Does it work at a year? You're asking the payer to make oftentimes a sizable investment into this patient by covering the technology. They need to understand that there is going to be an earn back, that they are going to get their money back. When I was at United Healthcare, I saw a lot of technologies, and the clinical team would say, "Hey, this sounds really great." They would hand it to me, and I'd be like, "Okay, well, what does it cost?" And they go, "Oh, it's $30,000." And I would look at it and be like, "Well, our cost to treat the condition in a 1-year period is $20,000. It's going to take us, all this time, a year and a half just to break even on this device. Is the patient still going to even be with us as a payer in 18 months? Statistically, probably not. So we would sometimes pass on those technologies unless we had a real other important reason to do it. But just proving that there is a path for the payer, that there is validity to the study, that there are outcomes that they care about, that a lot of payers are profit-making entities, so an outcome that will earn them a profit.
And I know we want to get to a few questions from the audience, but just from the regulatory perspective, when you're trying to go in a unified pathway with reimbursement expectations and regulatory expectations, my goal is speed to market. Let's get this to market as quickly as possible. So you sort of have to be creative when you're designing your study to include the reimbursement components as well as what the FDA is going to expect. So you're not overcommitting to FDA that you're going to run a 3-year study, even though reimbursement wants that. They may only want a 1-year study. So there's a component of transparency with FDA as to why you're designing the study the way you are. Such that you're coming in to get approval at 1 year, but yet you've built the infrastructure and protocol for patients to go out to 3 years. So it's a confluence of a bunch of things.
Thank you. So let's open it up to you guys in our last 5 minutes. Who has questions for this group? Yeah. David, do you want to start there?
I didn't expect it to work actually, but made the call, and I would say it was used to support a product line that was no longer a feature product line of theirs. If they wanted to slow us down, they could have. I think they had an interest in our technology. They had this data set. I just said, it's sitting on the shelf. We could make use of it. It could be a win-win situation here. And it allowed them to, I think, kind of monitor how we were progressing. But yeah, for a recently approved product, I don't think that would work. But it was a study that had been completed about 5 years before, and it was kind of, I suppose, a unique situation, but they were willing to part with it for a fee, of course. But it was controversial, and it took a year of trying to get through that, to get that completed.
And the acceptability from the FDA perspective in that scenario, because they're purists just like Max, they want randomized controlled studies. And to come in with a store-bought control, they freaked out a little bit. Now, granted, it was patient-level data. It had it wasn't, not borrowing from a literature article where it's just sort of glosses over the details. We could dig into this data set and really look at it and then run propensity score matching to what the enrollable investigative arm was. So we really had a good assessment and argument to utilize that control in that case.
And one thing just to add to that in our last couple seconds is we even had to adjudicate that data. So we went that granular into that all the safety data that came in, we had to run a CEC to adjudicate that. So that was a lot. Yeah. So, well, it looks like we're at time. So thank you everyone for coming, and thank you guys for joining me up here.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you so much.